Welcome everyone to Discover This. Today we're going to have another story on the mafia, organized crime, and things like that in San Diego. And we're going to talk about a guy by the name of Tony Mirabile. So maybe you've heard the name, maybe you haven't, but we're going to kind of tell a little bit about Tony Mirabile and how he came to be murdered here in San Diego. So Antonio Mirabile, aka Tony Mirabile, was born on January 1st, 1894 in Alcamo, Sicily. His brother Paul was born 2.5 years later, also in Alcamo. In October 1907, their father had died, and both Tony and Paul sailed from Naples, Italy to New York. And then they traveled on to Detroit, where they had family. Tony applied for U.S. citizenship in March of 1915. And Tony also started hanging around some of the underworld figures in Detroit and started getting arrested for various things. Grand larceny, violation of prohibition laws. You see, Michigan had its own prohibition laws. They were a dry state before the United States went to prohibition. And Tony had fallen in with the notorious Purple Gang, a violent gang that eventually became Detroit's mafia family. Tony and Paul stayed in Detroit for 13 years, with Tony hanging out with the Hoods and Paul spending some time going to college in Canada. Tony became a U.S. citizen in November 1920, and shortly after, both Tony and Paul left Detroit and headed to Los Angeles. Now, if you remember, in Los Angeles around that time, the Dragna brothers were heavily involved in what was basically the Italian mob. And Tony ended up becoming associated with the Dragnas in 1921. In 1924, Tony and Paul crossed into Mexico, and they ended up opening 2 bars on Avenue de Revolucion. One of them was called Midnight Follies. The Dragnas and other mafia-associated Sicilians would visit the Mirabiles in Tijuana, and there was also a small Italian colony down in Tijuana at the time. Now, Paul would book entertainment into the Midnight Follies, including one performer by the name of Margarita Cancino, who would later come to be known by the name Rita Hayworth after she moved to Hollywood. In fact, Paul would later claim he had helped Margarita Cancino get to Hollywood. Midnight Follies, besides bar and restaurant, also had dancing, gambling, slot machines, and all that to keep the people coming back. In 1933, Midnight Follies burned to the ground, and shortly after, both Tony and Paul Mirabile moved to San Diego. So after Prohibition ended, Tony ended up opening a bar called the Rainbow Gardens here at 409 F Street in downtown San Diego. And he reportedly opened this with money that was loaned to him by Nick Licata, a former Detroit Mafia member who had moved to LA and become part of the Dragna LA crime family. Licata would later become head of the LA crime family in late 1969, early 70, somewhere in there. But Tony early on started investing in stocks, buying as many as he could, as often as he could, and Rainbow Gardens proved to be very popular. In fact, many nights the line would go around the block down there, people waiting to get in. You know, they'd let a couple people out and a couple more in. But as Tony got into the bar and liquor business, Paul got into the restaurant business. And he opened the Saratoga Grill right here at 226 Broadway, between 2nd and 3rd in downtown San Diego. Saratoga Grill was very popular. Now, if you recall from our Frank Bompensiero video, the Gold Rail Cafe is right there on that corner, and all along 3rd Avenue up that way was a number of bars controlled by the LA mob. But the Saratoga Grill was right in here. Now, in addition to restaurants, Paul started investing in real estate, and he bought some properties in Alpine, downtown San Diego, along Balboa Park, and elsewhere. And by the 1940s, Tony and Paul were worth over $1 million, which was quite a hefty sum back in that day. Now, in addition to Rainbow Gardens, Tony also opened a place called the Barbette. It's B-A-R-B-E-T, maybe it's Barbet, I don't know. But it was right across the street here at 836 4th Avenue, where Horton Plaza is now. So kitty corner from Rainbow Gardens. Tony also opened the Senator Cafe here at 101 F Street in downtown San Diego. In addition to, he had Rainbow Gardens and the Barbette or Barbet, but it would have been right around in here at the time. It was another popular place a lot of people came to. Now, another restaurant that Paul opened was called Paul's Inn, and it was right here at 1245 4th Avenue, basically the corner of 4th and A, where this high-rise is now. But Paul's Inn, very upscale and very, very popular. A lot of the LA mobsters would come down and eat here, but also a lot of regular folks. But it was very upscale. So Tony started loaning money to his friends, mostly Italian Americans, many with connections to the LA family, so that they could open their own liquor establishments. This is how Tony came to be associated with some of the many liquor places. Although he only had his name in 3 liquor licenses, he was eventually involved in some capacity with around 30 different establishments in San Diego. So Tony had many of the LA family mobsters come to Rainbow Gardens, and they would also sometimes eat at Paul's Inn. While loaning money to various organized crime types at better rates than they would get at a bank, Tony reportedly offered Jack Dragna $150,000 to make him a made man in the LA family, and Dragna reportedly accepted the offer. Now, as word of that arrangement got around, some began to have disgust for Tony Mirabile for buying his way in instead of working his way up, as most of the rest of the folks had to do. Dragna was impressed with Tony Mirabile's Detroit connections and his ability to turn a profit, either legitimately or criminally, and he became known as Papa Tony for his generous loans. One of the guys who was working his way up through the Dragna controlled family and who put in lots of work for the family was Frank Bompensiero. Bompensiero also worked for a time for Tony Mirabile at Rainbow Gardens, working the door here and some other things that he did around the shop here. All the while he was also working for Jack Dragna. Many people felt Tony Mirabile was a joke, although they still took his loans. As Frank Bompensiero was moving up the food chain, Tony Mirabile reportedly loaned the Bomp and the Dragna brothers the money to buy the Gold Rail bar. He also reportedly gave them another large chunk to buy furnishings and other things for the bar. Many believe this loan was done under coercion. Frank Bompensiero would end up being put in charge of San Diego by the Dragnas, so Tony effectively worked for Frank at that point. So at one point, Frank Bompensiero and some other mobsters in San Diego met with Tony Mirabile and basically told him he was kind of old and weak and getting in the way, and he needed to go back to Sicily. They had purchased him a one-way ticket, but the day before Mirabile was due to leave, he got sick and couldn't travel, and he ended up staying in San Diego. Now, in 1956, while Frank Bompensiero was in prison, Jack Dragna died unexpectedly. Frank DeSimone was made boss of the LA family over Momo Adamo, who, although the underboss, did not get enough votes to be put in charge, possibly by some shenanigans by Frank DeSimone. DeSimone did not like Bompensiero and immediately demoted the Bomp and put Tony Mirabile in charge of San Diego for the LA mob family. So after being put in charge of San Diego for the LA family, Tony was basically the godfather for San Diego. And he rubbed elbows with many of the underworld figures from different parts of the country as they came to San Diego or LA. Or he would sometimes travel to Arizona, where a number of mobsters started moving to and staying at least part of the year. This photo shows Tony Mirabile on the left with Joseph Bonanno, Joe Bananas, in the dark suit on the right at the Moulin Rouge in Hollywood. Now, most of the time Tony would have a bodyguard with him, and sometimes those bodyguards were part of the family, or one time or another they were former police officers from San Diego PD. And even though, remember, he was in charge, many people did not really like or respect Tony Mirabile. Tony was living in one of the apartment buildings he and Paul owned by Balboa Park, and Tony had a penthouse apartment overlooking the park. Many mornings Tony would walk over to Balboa Park and just take a walk around the park, and he started becoming intrigued with the amount of homeless people that were starting to congregate in the park. And Tony couldn't understand how in this country of opportunity, how someone could be homeless. And on occasion he would chat with these homeless people and try and figure out, you know, why they were living like that. So more of the homeless thing will come up later, but this is the Palomar Apartments, just one of the buildings they owned. Now, it's said that Tony lived on the 3rd floor penthouse, but I'm thinking that may be the penthouse up there. But either way, and his balcony would have been overlooking the park. So there was a number of people who knew that Tony carried a lot of money and had a lot of money in his apartment. So a couple guys got together, and one knew of Tony's money, and they plotted a scheme to rob him at his apartment. They involved a couple other people, and it grew to about 5 people altogether. Now, one of the people involved had been at one time a bodyguard for Tony and knew the layout of his apartment. What they didn't know was that Tony's nephew was also living at the apartment in another bedroom. So on December 27th, 1958, around 1 a.m., Tony was expecting a female guest at his apartment. See, a friend in Las Vegas said he was sending a girl over to Tony as a gift of sorts. So a gal by the name of Jean Horton was part of this scheme, and she called Tony Mirabile from a payphone at 5th and Maple. So could have been this one here, or if there was one on one of these other corners, but this is 5th and Maple today. So she calls Tony and says she's outside, and Tony told her to come on up. So when there was a knock at the door, Tony opened the door and he saw a blonde woman standing there, and he let her in, and as soon as she walked in, a guy came rushing in and said, "This is a robbery." So Tony started fighting back, and he called for his nephew who was in the other room, and the fight drug on, and Tony ended up being shot to death in his bathroom. All the suspects fled, and there were some waiting outside in a car, and they all took off and left Tony laying dead in this bathroom. Here's the interesting part. The San Diego Police Department determined pretty much right away at least one of the people involved in this murder, and that would be Victor Francis Buono, a former San Diego police officer, a very successful bail bondsman, and the father of Victor Buono, the famous actor. You see, Buono was the one who knew the layout of Tony's apartment, and he knew that Tony kept lots of money there. So he was the mastermind of the plot. Now, Buono had already been convicted of and sent to prison for smuggling birds, of all things, and he was on parole from that crime. So the police were so sure of Buono's involvement that they actually sent some of their detectives to talk to some of San Diego's known mob associates to tell them not to whack Victor Buono, that they wanted to arrest him and put him on trial. So Buono and all the others were arrested, and they all ended up getting convicted for their part in Tony Mirabile's murder. Victor Buono ended up serving 7 years in prison for his part. However, after 7 years, the federal government asked that he stay in prison longer because he was out on parole for his bird smuggling caper. So he stayed in prison a little longer. Now, if you watched our video on Victor Buono, the actor, and his time in San Diego, you saw that Victor Buono, the father, is not buried near Victor Buono and his mother. Now, this could be because of his criminal issues. Maybe that's why he's in a completely other part of the cemetery, the whole opposite end, as a matter of fact. I'm just guessing, but not positive, but could be. So now, reportedly, after Tony's murder, Paul Mirabile took over as the guy in charge of San Diego for the LA family. And that may have been somewhat short-lived, because there were others who wanted that spot. In fact, Joseph Matranga was one of them. And eventually Joseph Matranga, whose mentor was Tony Mirabile, became in charge of San Diego for the LA mob. Now, Tony had amended his will in the years prior to his death and named his brother Paul his primary beneficiary and executor. Together they owned 3 apartment buildings overlooking Balboa Park. They owned properties in Little Italy, and Tony had a long list of stocks and bonds going all the way back to the early 30s. Now, Paul Mirabile died in 1990, and the bulk of his estate, which included Tony's estate, was bequeathed to Father Joe's Villages, and the Paul Mirabile Center for the Homeless was built downtown near 15th and Imperial. So that's going to do it, everyone, for this story of Tony Mirabile, the one-time Godfather of San Diego, and his murder, not at the hands of the mafia, but by Victor Buono, or at least the Victor Buono being the mastermind of this caper. So I thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. Please hit the like button, and please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you can know when the next videos are coming up. We've got a lot more coming. And I do thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Discover This.